If we haven't got the chance to meet yet, my name is James. I get the honor and privilege of serving and leading the youth and young adult ministries here at Transformation Church alongside my wife. And as we get started this morning, I've got a quick question for you. Have you ever wanted to believe something and you really tried hard, but you just couldn't convince yourself it's true? Have you ever tried to believe something and you just couldn't shake your doubt? For those of you that don't know, my wife, Emily, the most beautiful woman on planet Earth. And so, men, I'm sure you can agree for your situation as well, but I married up. Any men that married up in the room, you can go ahead, raise your hand. It's an easy win, guys. There you go. But I married up, and so, but even still, I remember a point in my life where I doubted that I was ever going to get married. Anybody in the room like, man, God didn't make my person. I'm not getting married. It's going to be me and Jesus forever. Well, that was me. And obviously it's not. I met my wife. We eventually started dating, got engaged, got married. And I remember our wedding day so perfectly. I'm standing at the altar. I've got my back turned, waiting for her to get in the aisle. And if you don't know me, I'm uberly emotional. I cry a lot. I'm okay with that. But also, I'm an ugly crier. And so I'm standing there like boohoo crying. And these thoughts begin to run through my mind because it wasn't if I was going to get married, but I still doubted. And so maybe you can sympathize with me. Some of my doubts were, am I good enough to be a husband? Am I good enough to be her husband? Maybe it's, am I good enough to be a father? Am I good enough to lead my family? And then for those of you that don't know, I come from a divorced house. My mom and my dad divorced when I was young. And so the thoughts started creeping in, what's going to make my marriage any different? And these thoughts just begin to run through. But once again, all my married couples in the room know that as soon as you turn around in that moment, I see her, everything goes away. It's the most perfect moment. And I felt God in it. But fairy tales don't last forever. You see, my wife and I experienced one of the most heartbreaking days of our life less than 6 months into our marriage. On February 26, 2023, we left the church, headed to the emergency room because we had had a miscarriage of our first baby. My wife and I wanted kids early on. We wanted to have kids young, and we were super, super excited. And all of a sudden, in a matter of minutes, it felt like my whole world fell apart. I think what made it a little more difficult, if I can be really honest with you, is I did the little segment Pastor Ryan just did. I did that morning. And in that moment, I made the statement, you're a good God when it makes sense and when it doesn't. And less than 2 hours later, I'm having to live that out for myself. I've got a picture up on the screen of myself in the emergency room. Emily took this picture. And I can tell you exactly what I was thinking in that moment because my doubts were running wild. My thoughts were, God, where are you? My thoughts were, God, do you really work these situations out for my good? And as I'm almost like screaming and crying out at God, like not knowing my situation and not understanding why this is happening to me, I think this last one can go over all situations and circumstances, but I'm sitting there and I'm praying to God, do you even see me? And in that moment, in that season of heartache and just distraught, I learned something about myself that has marked me ever since. And it's this. Yes, I believe in God. I'm going to make that very clear. I believe in God. But sometimes I still doubt. And I think at some point in our walk with Jesus, all of us in the room will face some doubt. Maybe you're there today. Maybe your relationship with God hit a really big high. You're super excited. You're reading your Bible. You're doing your Bible in a year, and you're perfectly checked off. You ain't a day behind. Like, you're on fire for God. But all of a sudden, a situation or a circumstance changes, and it cripples our faith. What are some of these things? Maybe they're unanswered prayers. Have you ever prayed to God for something and believed for it to be true, and it just didn't happen? Maybe it's you asking God for the job or the position or direction in your life and you didn't get it and you feel lost and you don't know what's next, and you find yourself asking, God, are you even listening to me? Maybe you have an unexpected loss, a parent, a child, a sibling, grandparent. Maybe it's a miscarriage like we went through. Maybe it's a lost friendship, broken relationship that you thought was meant to last, and you're asking yourself, God, if you're so good, why did this happen to me? Maybe it's promises that haven't been fulfilled, and you're saying, God, why am I not married by now? Why don't I have the promotion that I thought you had promised me by now? Why don't I have the house that I've always wanted? And why don't I have my dreams yet? And we start to question, did we even hear God? God, is that even you? You see, I think it's important for us to know that these moments in our life don't mean that we lack faith. They just mean that we're human. You're like, why? Why is that true? Because doubt is normal. Doubt is normal. And I want us to understand that as I was reading the Gospels in this season of my life, something stuck out to me. Jesus' 12 closest friends, his 12 disciples, they walked with him, they talked with him, they taught other people with him. And they watched him heal the sick, raise the dead, feed thousands when he should have only been able to feed a few. And even then, they still doubted. They doubted. And so today, if you've got your Bibles with me, let me see your Bibles. If you can hold them up, hold them up. Let's go all around the room. Okay. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 22. I want to give some background, though. We're looking at my man, Peter. Everybody say Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. And in this moment, all the disciples had been teaching with Jesus to large crowds of people. And then they encounter a situation in Matthew chapter 14 where Peter learns firsthand what it means to have faith but still struggle with doubt. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. If you're there, say, I'm there. Oh, come on, guys. If you're there, say, I'm there. There we go. Verse 22 says, immediately after the teaching, Jesus insisted that the disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. Jesus insisted. Everybody say insisted. I want you to remember that for later. After sending the people home, Jesus went up into the hills to pray by himself. Night fell while he was there alone. I've got some friends that sometimes I need distance from too, but we're not going to talk about that. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on water. What an interesting time to be the first man to walk on water at 3 a.m. I mean, I might have would have probably chose more like 9:30, gotten awake, got my hair done. Okay. But he walked out on the water, and when the disciples saw him, they were terrified. In fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." This is where my man Peter comes into play. He says, Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong winds and waves, he was terrified, and he began to sink. "Save me, O Lord," he shouted. And this is the verse 31, that I want us to really focus on. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" Today, I want to talk about this topic of a new way. Everybody say new way. A new way to wrestle with our doubts. A new way to wrestle with our doubts. As I was looking over this story and kind of pulling it apart, reading a little bit, trying to do some deep diving, I started to make some connections with this story that date back to my days in high school. Yes, I was not the best student. I was actually really not the best student. If my teachers are watching this, I'm really sorry. But I started to make some connections to my science classes. And I know you're like, what does the Bible and science have to do? Don't they really butt heads a lot? And actually in this moment, I would say that faith and science go hand in hand. Why is that? Because Peter is using the scientific method. And today, what I want us to do is I want us to break down how Peter used the scientific method and maybe how we can use it as well to struggle and wrestle with our doubts. And so let's look. Step number one of the scientific method is first, we must ask a question. We've got to ask a question. Why? Because in science, when you face a situation, a problem, it is not the end of your situation. It is actually just the beginning. In that same way, our faith begins with a question. And so what I realized in the moment of doubt and despair that we walked through, my doubt wasn't the end of my faith. It was actually just the beginning. You see, doubt shows us where our lid is. Doubt shows us the areas that maybe we haven't given full, complete trust to God. It shows us where our faith has stopped growing. You know, I like to say that I trusted God, but obviously in that season I trusted God with everything but my family. I would like to say that in other areas of my life when I've doubted God, that I trusted him with everything, but obviously there was something I was still holding on to. You see, even Peter had faith to step out onto the water, but when he realized the situation around him, he began to doubt. Faith, like science, starts with questions, and these questions might be, God, can I really trust you? Are you really there? Will you really come through for me? You see, Peter's question was simple. He said, Lord, if that's you, call me out. Tell me to come to you. He didn't just assume, he questioned. And then my next part, he investigated. Step number 2 is we've got to form a hypothesis. We've got to form a hypothesis. And my hypothesis and my situation was simple. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. Instead, what we see is we don't need perfect faith to step out. Peter obviously didn't have his faith together. Why? Because he eventually ended up sinking. But his faith was big enough to start the test. His faith was big enough to be tested. And his hypothesis was simple. He said, Jesus, if that's you, if you're really him, you're going to call me out and I'm going to walk on the water. I'm going to get there. Now, I think what we forget is that Peter wasn't reading Matthew chapter 14, verses 31, 32, 33, when he stepped out of the boat. Like, he didn't have that. That wasn't a thing yet. And so Peter's probably like, okay, I'm getting out of the boat. Are you actually going to catch me? Like, he's probably a little hesitant and scared at first, but he was willing to test it. So I want to do a demonstration this morning. My friend Dawson's going to come and join me. We've got a prop from backstage that's coming up. Yeah, you can give it up with him. He's a good-looking fella. Dawson, I've got a question for you. This chair right here, do you think if you stand on it, it can hold you? Okay. Are you sure it can hold you? We're going to find out for sure. Here we go. Okay. You see, the thing is sometimes we're really, really strong in our faith until someone starts to shake it a little bit. And then our faith begins to not cripple, but it begins to make way for the doubts in our mind. It begins to make way for the thoughts and the things of the what-if situations. God, are you really going to help me out? Are you really going to be faithful in my moment? And then you add the component of you can't always see clearly. Can you put that over your eyes for me? So then you add in the component of, man, I can't really see my situation as clear. I could move this chair. I could spin Dawson around. I could do a lot of different things. And then God has a funny way of in the moment where we can't see everything so clearly. He says this. He says, Dawson, can you stand on the chair for me? Yep, there it is. And he begins to stand up on the chair. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to count. Don't let me count because I don't want him to hurt himself. And Dawson, when I say go, I want you to fall backwards. And I want you to trust that me and my microphone are going to catch you. You think you can do that for me? All right, here we go. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Are you ready? Go. You can give it up for him. Thanks, fellas. You see, faith isn't the absence of doubt. What faith actually is the ability to trust when we can't see things clearly. It's the ability for us to look at our situation and say, God, I don't know why. I don't know why, but you are a good God when it makes sense and when it doesn't. Romans 8:28 says, we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. We know, which leads us to step number 3. If we formed our question and we know what we're looking at and we're able to identify it, then we next have to test it. We have to conduct an experiment. Now, I know we just conducted an experiment, but really our experiment is taking our doubts to Jesus. You see, faith, it's super easy to be an idea when things are going well, when life is going good, when everything's sunshine, rainbows, and roses. But when it gets tested, that's when faith really steps into action. Your faith can't be just an idea. It has to be something that has been tested and proven. Peter's faith was tested because he actually stepped out into the water. Peter's faith was tested because he trusted Jesus to get out of the boat. But his experiment didn't go right for him. It went wrong along the way. And sometimes when we take our eyes off of Jesus and we begin to look at the situation around us, it begins to cloud our judgment. It begins to cloud our faith. And that's when doubt creeps in. But you see, Peter looked at the waves that were crashing, the wind that was howling, and the fear that overtook him, and suddenly he started to sink. Doubt happens when we put our faith in a situation or ourselves instead of in God himself. That's how we allow doubt to creep in. Have you ever had that moment where you trusted God until everything hit the fan? You prayed, but your prayers didn't get answered. What I want to propose to you is what I love about verse 31 that I don't know if you really caught when we were reading through it. 14, verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. Jesus immediately, in Peter's failure, in Peter's doubt, reached out and grabbed him. It wasn't, okay, Peter, I'm going to let you drown for a second because I know you didn't trust me. I just got to let you learn your lesson, and then I'm going to grab. No, immediately he was there to rescue him. You see, your doubt doesn't disqualify you. Your doubts in life, no matter how big, no matter how small, they don't disqualify you. Why? Because Jesus is big enough to handle your doubt. When you take your doubts to him, when you take them to him, it gives him an opportunity to respond. When we struggle with our faith, it gives him the ability to reach out and carry us. When we feel like we're sinking and we reach for him, it gives him the opportunity for him to grab our hands. And once we've tested him and he's proven himself faithful, because I don't know if you've read the same Bible that I am, but my Bible tells me that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that means that if he didn't fail back then, he's not going to fail me now, and he's not going to fail my kids and my grandkids later. He is faithful and true and can be tested. So once we test it, we have to analyze what happened. Now, this is where I'm going to get honest and vulnerable, if that's okay. Because in my first breakthrough analysis of our miscarriage in the situation, it didn't look good. There is no way I cannot directly point to anything out of that situation that I can say, oh, because this happened, this happened. I can't. And man, stuff like that, emotions like that, they hit you in waves. Just a few weeks ago, I'm driving home on a Wednesday night with my wife, and the baby's in the back, and I just get really emotional. I begin to cry, and I just grab her hand, and she's like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like, what's going on? And the only words I could get out of my mouth are, there's supposed to be 2 car seats in this car. I'm not saying that your situation is going to perfectly work out for a good thing, but what I am saying is when we focus on just one specific moment rather than all that God is doing in our life, we'll miss out on all the other little blessings happening around us. What I could have done is I could have sat in my loathing, sat in my pity, and missed out on every single step that God orchestrated. In that season, we began to transition. I had transitioned roles here at the church. In that season, we had new people stepping into our life that we couldn't be here without. In that season, we bought a house, we bought a home, we bought a new car. Like, all these things were happening that shouldn't have been happening, but it would have been very easy for me to look at my situation and magnify that and say, God, you're not here with me. Peter could have thought and said, I failed. I should have never got out of the boat. I started strong, but I messed up, because it's often that previous doubts, they like to stick in your back pocket, previous situations. And whenever God calls you to be faithful, when he calls you to step out in faith, it's that likes to stick its head back in and say, wait, he wasn't faithful then. Why is he going to be faithful now? Peter could have not stepped out of the boat. But the key is that he never let him drown. Peter cried out and Jesus grabbed him. What if in your season of doubt, Jesus is actually closer to you than you think? What if in your situation, because in that moment, in that picture, man, I don't feel the presence of God. I don't feel this big, loving, warm embrace. I can tell you what I felt. I felt anger. I felt disappointment. I felt confusion, and I felt anxiety, not knowing, was it something we did? Is it something wrong with us? And I didn't feel the presence of God. But maybe that's because even though we don't feel the presence of God in our situation, he's already worked it out for our good. And once we do our testing and our analysis and we look back on the faithfulness of God, it leads us to step 5, which is my personal favorite. This is my favorite one, y'all. We have to share the results. We have to share what has been done in our life. Why? Because your story matters. Your testimony matters. You see, the final step in the scientific method is publication. Could you imagine if someone discovered the cure to cancer and they didn't share it? Like, people would be up rioting. People would be up in the same way. When God does something in your life, when God moves a mountain, no matter how big or how small you think it is, your story has the ability to change the hearts and the lives of people around you. Your story has the power to bring hope and life to dead situations. Your story has the power to raise dry bones and breathe life back into them. In faith, when God moves in our life, it's a necessity that we share our story so that others can be encouraged. You see, Peter's story was recorded in the Bible, right? We got to read it. Do you know how many people have read the story of Peter? In probably top 3, one of his lowest moments of his life. You know how many people have read that? And instead of seeing him for his failure, they look at that and say, man, if Peter can get back up, I can get back up too. You want to know why? Because we see in the book of Acts that Peter kind of has this avenging moment where he kind of does something super cool. And he actually is the disciple that Jesus chose to build the church on. Peter was actually one of the sparks that lit this revival that we now call Christianity today. Your story, no matter how high, no matter how low, has the ability and the power to encourage and lift someone up in their lowest moment. What if your struggle, your doubt, and your journey aren't meant for nothing else but to help someone else trust God? What if the only reason that we went through that situation was so that someone else could see the faith in our life after that and be encouraged because of it? Would you be okay if that was the only reason? Would you be okay if the only reason was so that we could be tested, grow our faith, and so that it can encourage others? You see, because I can look and say that, man, it never will make sense, because reality is it probably won't. I'll probably never understand why we had to go through that. Or I can say, God, you work all situations for not only my good, but for other people's good. So I'm going to use what you've given me, no matter how painful, no matter how hurtful, no matter how distraught I get. God, I'm going to use that situation for your glory. And I'm going to use it so that your name can be magnified. Like in science, your story and your words and your testimony, complete with the questions and the examinations and all the things, can illuminate the path for others. And when Peter stepped out of the boat, even when he sank, it wasn't just something he learned. It was something billions of people have learned from since. And here, if I can take a moment, if I can just take a moment of your time, as we're wrapping up, if you didn't get anything else out of this, life hits all of us really hard. I'm not saying that your pain is better or worse than mine, because the reality is I don't walk in your shoes and you don't walk in mine. What I do know, though, is God took what looked to be ashes and he began to place people in my life. He began to place couples in my life. He began to place people, young, old, that have encountered similar situations of loss, hurt, and distraught. And all they begin to do is they would send little gift cards of like, hey, just buy yourself dinner. Don't worry about cooking tonight. We'd see them on a Sunday morning and they'd come up and they'd give us a hug. And it just was that like warm mama bear kind of hug. No words. They begin to pour into us in a way that I always watch people go through hurt, and I never understood why I would just give them a hug and not say anything, but having walked through it, I know now. And I say all this to say that when we have doubts, it's not always our wrestling that can save us. Typically, it's the community that we surround ourselves with that really knows how to pick us back up. It's the community that you're planted in that begins to encourage you, hey, I know you're feeling this way, but I promise you God's moving, God's stirring, he's doing something new in your life. And when we plant ourselves in community, whether it's small groups, whether it's Dream Team, if you're not, I'm telling you, you need to do this. Why? Because if it wasn't for the community that we found in that season, I don't know that I'd be here today. I don't know that I'd be standing on this platform today. Why? Because I can tell you stories of me standing right here in front of this last chair on this aisle, lifting my hands during worship, and in the back of my mind, the thoughts are running, do I really believe these words that I'm singing? It's in our wrestling and our faith when we gather ourselves in community that we truly begin to grow. Faith grows stronger in community. And so I want you to know your doubts don't disqualify you. It only invites you into deeper faith this morning. But it's our choice what we do with it. When we doubt, are we still going to pray? When we doubt, are we still going to join our small group and attend? When we doubt, are we still going to lift our hands in worship anyways? Do we doubt and then do nothing, or do we doubt and then respond? If you're wrestling with doubt today, I know that you're in good company. Because the disciples doubted too. And if I could just speak for everyone, I'm sure we've all doubted in this room before. Even as Jesus and Peter have this exchange, the exchange didn't happen in the boat. It happened on the water because it first took a step of faith. So I want to encourage you this morning, if you're looking for that step of faith, try getting connected into community. The boat was a safe place, but the water is where Peter really met Jesus.
Thank you so much for tuning in with us. If you enjoyed today's message, go ahead and subscribe because there's content like this every single week. And if it spoke to you in any way, make sure you share it with a friend because you never know whose life you can change with just one simple share. Listen, we hope to see your face in the place this Sunday. Go ahead and check out our website for our service times at transformtlh.com, and we hope to see you soon.